You're listening to the Procuretech podcast, your weekly show for all that's cooking in the digital procurement space. Yes, we've got the hottest startups, thought leadership, and conversation from visionary industry experts, and definitely no stiff corporate content. I'm your host, James Meads, Procurement Pro, Digital Nomad, and Procuretech fanboy. And now, here's this week's show. Yes, hello everybody. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to a live edition of the Procuretech podcast. This is the Procuretech Pub, where every few weeks we do a live stream episode on LinkedIn Live and live on Twitter. We're streaming to as well, before we then package it up and put it into a podcast episode the following week. And I'd like to welcome today a very renowned guest to the show, Dr. Elouise Epstein of Kearney. Very warm welcome and good morning to you. And thankfully, it's not too early where you are, is it? I thought I was waking you up at some ungodly hour.
It's lovely to be here. Thank you for having me. Not quite pub time here, although I am in New York. So it's 10 o'clock. So I've got a few more hours to go. But yes, not as early as normal when I'm in there.
And just to be certain, I don't drink on the job either. So it's while it's called the pub, and I would very much like to be having a glass of wine while I'm doing this, I shall save that until after the interview and I've gone home for the evening. So much to talk about in this space, but let's start at the very, very beginning. So you've been in this space for a lot longer than, I guess, a lot of people. So for those that maybe haven't come across you, let's just do a really quick whistle-stop tour of how you got into this space and your background. And then I think once we've done that, it would be great to dig into a little bit of the history of procurement tech, to do a very quick sort of chronological history of where we've come from, and hopefully to speculate about where we're going to.
Awesome. Well, so that's a kind way of saying that I've been in this industry for a long time and I'm old. So I started in the 2000s with the .com explosion, and I went to work for a company called Abbreviate, which was at the time funded by EDS, back when EDS actually existed. And it was a reverse auction tool. So one of the first e-sourcing tools to come into the market. It was started by former Kearney partners. And because at the time, Kearney was owned by EDS. And so I got in at the ground floor of this first wave of procurement technology. I'm actually probably going to mix both your questions. But, well, first of all, after about 2002, everything collapsed when the bubble crashed. And coming out of the bubble, the Procuretech, the reverse auctions, the first ERFP tools, the first supplier search tools, if you could call them that, actually survived. Then they did along until you started to get Ariba really coming into its own. You had Taurus coming into its own. And eventually, when you got to 2008, 2009, 2010, you had to start to have some of this first consolidation of all these best of breeds at the time it was, and they came together. And so career-wise, I took a step to the side. That's when big data was a thing, and data science was just emerging. So I spent a couple of years doing big data and data science for procurement supply chain. And then about 2016, 2017, we started getting a lot of inbound requests from clients saying, "Hey, we bought these suites and we don't know, our users hate them, they won't use them, and what do we do?" And I mean, when you call Kearney, we're expensive, so you're not coming to us with trivial problems. And so the more we uncovered and looked at it, it was a staggering problem. And so I decided to re-engage. And the deeper I got into this, the more I realized, on one hand, we had a very consumerized experience with, the Amazon experience. And on the other hand, we had this corporate buying, which looked nothing like Amazon. So to make a long story short, I realized that I made the argument that we needed to be in the platform era as procurement, and not everybody wanted to hear that in 2017, but by about 2020, 2021, that has become the de facto perspective. And so my career has kind of gone along those peaks and valleys, shall we say.
Do you think COVID has accelerated that, in the sense that if you've got a clunky, non-intuitive platform and everyone's working from home, then I guess you can't wander down the hallway or to someone's cubicle from procurement to ask them for some training, right? It's I guess that must be part of it.
Absolutely. What I really saw the change take hold was with the trade wars, when all of a sudden companies couldn't figure out what the implications were on suppliers they had in China or not. I mean, granted, it was the U.S. and China, but that sent cascading waves through the broader procurement community. And then, so the trend that really started to solidify this trend. And then we got to the pandemic, and the pandemic just blew it open and accelerated this like nothing else. So I think very much the pandemic drove this, but the trend was already in place. It accelerated for the reasons you said. And simultaneously, we learned very quickly how to be 100% remote. And that, when you're remote, then that becomes the de facto way of working, and bad user experiences become very clear very quickly.
Yeah, and I mean, it's kind of gone a little bit full circle though now, hasn't it? And certainly we'll talk a little bit about your spider diagrams, infamous spider diagrams in a minute or two, but it's gone from very much a suite dominated market to, as you said, especially pre-COVID and during COVID, the best of breed approach has really taken hold. And I'm talking now mainly about enterprise. For mid-market and smaller businesses, there's a separate argument. But most enterprises now, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this, but my feeling and what I'm hearing from the market is that most enterprises now seem to be pursuing kind of a hybrid approach, whereby they will have some sort of central system as a single source of truth, be that, a vendor master data platform like a Tealbook or like a Brooklyn Vendor Assurance, or, one of the big sort of legacy P2P suites, of which I guess Ariba and Cooper as market leaders have got the biggest share. But then, and I think having the app stores that SAP and Cooper have brought in is sort of tantamount to that. They're enabling the best of breed solutions to feed into that now, aren't they? So do you think that's here to stay, or do you think that's just another transitionary phase in this whole evolution?
Early in my career, it was all best of breed and an era where we didn't have platforms. And what happened is we sort of ran into the problem of integrations, and then the bigger fish came along and ate the smaller fish, and then it became the de facto were suites, and everybody was talking about suite, and closed loop systems, and I bought into that in the 2010s or so far, because I decided that Procuretech was solved. Like, procurement, we got this. Like, we're gonna good to go. Well, I'll answer this in two ways. I think we missed the mark because the suites failed to deliver. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And so what you have in corporate enterprises today is legacy sunk cost investments. And some work better than others, and others are just, well, you can fill in the blank there or use your imagination. But I think what happened is the suites actually, because mTORUS no longer exists. You could argue a couple of the others are on life support. And I think, so I'm a big critic of the traditional suite technology. I'm a big advocate for the platform approach. And the platform approach is what Salesforce has done, what all sort of AWS, Azure, where you have a core platform and then you build off of it. I don't think anybody has solved 100% the procurement platform, but I think that's where we're going, because there's too much investment in these startups and new innovations, which we need. So I think we're going to have another decade in this platform as the platforms mature. What comes after that is probably, we will probably experience another change. But I think right now there's no doubt that we are in the platform era. We just don't have 100% the platforms that we need.
So if I paraphrase that correctly, then we are going to need a platform that best of breeds or solutions all plug into as having a sort of single center of the ecosystem, but it doesn't necessarily need to be one of the legacy suites, even though de facto in a lot of enterprises it's ended up being that, because they're all already plugged in and they I guess saw what's coming and have had the foresight to bring in, like what Salesforce is a great example, to have an app store that external solutions can plug into.
Well, and if I can make 2 points there, some of the suite providers have figured this out. Yes. Others have not. But also forget that, and that's true. You paraphrase that exactly right. And by the way, I have a half a dozen clients that have decided that the suite providers are not for them, and they have strong IT groups, and they built their own platforms. And I don't necessarily recommend this, but if you have the capabilities, they reap tremendous benefits. And one of my clients, they just rip P2P in and out, like as if it's not an issue at all. Like I'm going to guess weeks. I don't know what it was, but like changing P2P for them is no big deal because they have this central platform. And just like stop and think about that for a second. Just ripping out P2P and putting in a new one with almost no technical issues. That's tantamount to heresy in our world, because P2P is so complicated. And yet, if you do it right, if you do this platform approach right, the fact that you could plug and play P2P platforms is staggering to me.
Are they managing P2P then completely outside of ERP? I mean, I guess they have to link back somehow back into an ERP system to pay their vendors, right? There has to be some sort of final loop. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's their sort of platform is tied very nicely into their ERP system, so that they have this layer in between. So they're not dependent on the P2P plugging into the ERP. You're just plugging the P2P into this middleware sort of approach, which to me is just brilliant. I mean, it gives them the power to not be beholden to a P2P provider.
Yeah, and a lot of, in many instances, these legacy suites have kind of become glorified P2P systems, haven't they? Because that's the bit, as you alluded to, that's the bit that's really hard to migrate into something else. Especially if you're running an ecosystem that's tied in heavily to the ERP and they've done an expensive ERP integration with it. On the one hand, I guess companies are very risk averse to rip all that apart, and also they've got a lot of sunk cost in terms of the investment, because, as you said, if you hire a major consultancy, be it Kearney or be it one of the ones that are more into implementation and integration, it's not a cheap project usually to implement one of these. And I guess companies do have to be of a certain size to even be able to afford it.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly the difference. We've spent a lot of money on bad projects or projects that didn't land. And so we can't just immediately, like, I'd have no career if I walked in and said, well, you got to rip that out. So it is going to be an evolution, but you can already see that. So I tend to work with extreme leaders or extreme laggards, basically, because they're the ones that want to change the most and can afford Kearney rates. So the leaders have either gotten past that or have surmounted that hurdle. And I think the extreme laggards that want to leapfrog to the future recognize that they don't want to put all that sunk cost in again.
I mean, the suite market now is becoming more consolidated, and I think it would be a fool to argue against anyone that's sort of not in the park that I guess Ariba and Cooper are the sort of leading two in terms of market share. What do you see happening to the ones that have maybe fallen a little bit behind in terms of their market share? Do you think they will pivot and go best of breed, or do you think they will go a little bit down market and try and aim at mid-sized businesses to scoop up that segment? What are your thoughts on where that's going to go?
Well, I think first of all, I think the sweet market is artificially propped up. I don't think it's as expansive. I think it's under duress, and sort of what you were alluding to is, I think Coupa and Ariba are the de facto leaders. They're the two that I see in the large enterprises that effectively compete anymore. And you might get others in an RFP process, and every once in a while, one of them may break through and win the business. But I mean, between SAP's immense leverage into most enterprises and Coupa is clearly doing a lot of things right, so that they show well and perform well. So clearly those two. So I think the question for me is who steps in to challenge those two? That is not a traditional suite provider. Does a Salesforce, does an AWS, does a somebody else come along and interject themselves? As for the others that remain, I think they have a real challenge ahead of them. I think if they go best, or if they move to this platform approach and really leverage the innovation that's out there, then I think they can move potentially up, and maybe over 5 years, kind of work their way back into that big enterprise market. Or, as I argued in my most recent book, is they probably fall back into the mid-size, which is okay. That's perfect. That's not a criticism. That is the next frontier, the last frontier, whatever frontier. So I think that's that's not a pejorative statement. I just think there's a lot of opportunity. The problem for them is you have to reset your pricing models, because what you charge enormous enterprise is not what you charge. And I would also just make one other thing, that there are two other elements happening, right? Is as you start to see separations and the rise of private equity, I think the mid-market enterprise market's going to shift too. So I don't think our traditional construct of all this, I think that's going to change too in how we price this and how collectively Procuretech goes to the market. The other piece that I would say is that I think there's going to be, and this will get to my predictions at the end, but I also think there's going to be an ERP reconciliation at some point here. And and so that will disrupt this question too, because historically, if you look at how ERPs developed, and then P2P, S2P, or S2C, source to contract, procure to pay, how they all evolved separately. But I think very much, if you look at next generation ERP, it's got to be much more tightly embedded and designed with procurement, embedded, versus we're trying to connect two systems.
Versus just as an afterthought. What are your thoughts on Microsoft and Workday? Because they've both been on a bit of an acquisition spree in the procurements, with Microsoft buying Supply and Workday with Scout, and now is it Vendly that they recently acquired? Do you think they could be a challenger to SAP or Oracle in the ERP space?
Yeah. So, yes. The short answer is yes. Although Workday is somewhat opaque in what they do, so it's not clear if how far into this space they want to go, because they have an ERP solution too, and so I think they're certainly well positioned to do that. How aggressively they do that, or how conservatively they don't do that, they've been very measured. I think that's a question to be answered. I certainly think Microsoft would be a contender too. When you look at, they have the pieces in place with Dynamics and Supply, and if I could get an Satya, I would basically sell him that you should do exactly what I was just saying, is reimagine ERP with procurement embedded in it. And I think they have a really nice, between Azure and Dynamics and, their other assets in place, I think they could be a very strong contender very quickly. Whether they choose to do that or not, I mean, again, AWS could do the same thing with the entire Amazon supply chain sort of software that they've built. There's a lot of different options out there, and Google, you never know. There's a whole lot of smart engineers down there. So I think although those could be contenders, it's just the question is how quickly will it elevate up on their strategic agenda.
And would it even be for Amazon or Google? I mean, I guess there's a natural fit for Microsoft and to some extent Workday, but would Amazon even want to go into it? Because like you said, I mean, with Amazon Business, they could quite easily put together a guided buying solution, right? Because they pretty much, they've got the basic tech, most of the tech in place with their B2C solution, and with Amazon Business, it's growing like wildfire right now. And with the integrations that they're doing with a lot of the best of breed solutions in the source to pay space.
Yeah, I think that remains to be seen. But if you take the broader view of ERP has to go through a reconciliation and a reimagination, I think that opens the door for any and all possibilities. But I know that's like 3 or 4 steps away from the today. But I think if you're really looking at challengers, because coming out of COVID, the one thing we understand, the entire world understands, is supply chain disruptions. So much so that they're becoming a de facto excuse. So eventually enough people, enough money, enough effort will be put in, and some breakthrough will happen. Even if it's incremental, we'll eventually break through this logjam, or this intellectual logjam. And again, it's not just source to pay; it's ERP and source to pay.
Okay, so that's everything about sort of ERPs and suites. Let's move on now to the exciting stuff, which is more around the best of breed, specifically around. This is a mushrooming ecosystem, right? And there are a lot of best of lists out there. There's a lot of white papers being written. There's a lot of research on this topic. I'm always a little bit skeptical. Number one, for transparency, if I'm perfectly honest. But number two, it's so subjective, isn't it? I mean, if you go on Amazon and you want to buy a laptop and you read a review, you can get a pretty good idea of whether it's any good or not. But if you read a review on procurement software, well, something that a Fortune 500 company thinks is wonderful may be completely irrelevant to like a $250 million or euro company. And like the same argument as well in terms of procurement maturity and, how much clout it has as a function within an organization, whether they've got, I hate the word, but the seat at the table. What are your thoughts on these best of lists in general? I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, I think they have a purpose, and it's better that it's good to have a place to start. But is it reliable for someone to make their decision just based off of that?
Well, that's a big question. So this might turn into a lecture versus an answer, but we'll see how this goes. So I think I'm very critical of analysts. I'm very super critical of consultants, because I think we artificially inflate the market. We get excited collectively, and at the best case and the worst case is it's self-serving to create hype and create this whole chaos is really the only word I can think of. And I'm not a big fan in general of. I'm certainly not a fan of 2x2 evaluations, because I think that creates artificial markets, and it doesn't look at what's happening, what true innovation is happening, because you either have to fit into that framework, or you don't get identified. And so much of over the last 5 years, so much of the innovation doesn't fit neatly into a box. And by the way, those innovations shift and change on a, call it 6 month, a year, 18-month basis. So where you brought up Tealbook, where Tealbook started and where they are now, those are two vastly different things. And I could make that argument for a whole, many of them. So I think, that's my one comment. So I think you have to be very skeptical of the market and the hype and all of that. What you do have to understand is that there is a lot of innovation happening, which is a great thing, although it's hard to keep track of. And at the same time, what that tells me is that we need better buyers of this software. We have to upskill ourselves. So, and to me, it's a capability uplift that every one of us, not just the consultants, not just the analysts, not just the people in the market, but actually everybody that buys or uses the software has to level up to a degree to understand what's going on. Just like in our personal lives, we have to understand what Facebook and Netflix and Google are doing with our data, or even Amazon, that we have become products and they're using our data to make money. It's incumbent upon us as a society to understand that. I'm going off topic a little bit, but I think in a similar way, being in this digital era or this digital revolution, every person has to understand the data that's collected about them and how it's being used against them or for them. For or against can be both. And similarly, I would argue, just in society, we have to understand how these algorithms work and how our behavior gets manipulated. And that's not a bad thing. It's just the reality of the world we live in. Similarly, anybody that buys procurement software cannot just take a vendor's word for it, nor a consultant's word for it. And when I go into companies, I will give them an option, like 3, 4, 5, 6 options of who is probably doing the best or is the most mature at this capability. But then I leave it for them to run the RFP and make the evaluation, because no matter what I think as an outsider, and it might even be sort of inside the building, quote unquote, but at the end of the day, there are other considerations that I'm not privy to. And so I want my clients to make those decisions and to do the evaluations. Filtering all this massive noise down to a handful, that's my job. And just to sort of put a fine point on this and sort of circle back to the top 10 lists or the top whatever lists, I started tracking this market when there was less than 100 startups, and I have all these old materials, and old by being 5 years ago, where it was 250 million of venture capital funding, and I used to track this, and I used to meet with every one of these startups, and I talked to Steph at Tealbook. I would talk to her, and we would exchange information, and I would meet just about every founder, and I still meet lots and lots of founders. But my point is even the market's outgrown what I can do and what Kearney can do, because my little spreadsheet of 100 looks so quaint now. It looks so anachronistic, because there's the last numbers, it's got to be over $4 billion of VC funding in Procuretech specifically. And so ultimately, I don't do it anymore. I just can't. And in full disclosure, Kearney has a relationship with the Procuretech 100, and it's because Elouise is not couldn't do it anymore, and so we had to outsource that market evaluations to somebody else, because it's just too broad and too expansive. And so so that did kind of turn into a lecture. So
and I get it. And we've got 276 on procurementsoftware.site, and we've got another 35 that we're going to be adding in a few weeks' time. And Yeah, it's a very fine line, isn't it? Where do you draw the line? Because there is crossover from procure tech to legal tech to fintech to supply chain tech, and it's very subjective, isn't it, about where you cross the line? I mean, I've looked through Procuretech 100, and there are some that I personally wouldn't describe as being pure play procure tech, but then when you look at who the list was authored for, it's big enterprise level corporate organizations, and they probably would need to look at some of that. Whereas, a mid-market business wouldn't necessarily need a lot of the solutions that are in that list, which again goes back to start with the end in mind. Where do you want to get to? What's the purpose? But yeah, I agree. It's hard work, and it took me a long time to pull it all together.
Well, yeah. And also I think that you brought up a good point, because like at the big enterprise level, what you're seeing is, so you take legal. You have a legal department, and you have the sales side or the commercial side, and you have the procurement side, like three different users of legal software or legal tech. And eventually, like historically, commercial has bought their stuff and procurement's bought their stuff and legal's bought their stuff. I think at the enterprise level, I think they're starting to, and we've helped companies with this, started to consolidate that and actually use one legal tech platform. So it very quickly becomes it becomes a different discussion. Absolutely true for supply chain, because if you look at the more modern planning software or even the supplier collaboration software, they're really looking at this end to end. And so procurement is increasingly less focused on procurement as sort of a individual tower and more part of this bigger supply chain. And in fact, I would argue at the interval that the building the next generation supply chain is really a function for procurement as much as anybody else. I think we are a partner in that. And I think historically we have been over here as, on one thing, and the plan and make and deliver towers have been kind of over there separate. And I think that's an area of maturity where we have to come together. So I think it's a collective maturing in operations, supply chain, procurement, and the like. So, and I think that's all good. I think that's exciting, because at the enterprise level, you can't put lead box and have all this proliferation, just like you can't do risk. You can't just do risk with employees, because your biggest risks are going to come through your supply base. So like the fact that CIOs don't look at suppliers is just blows my mind, that like, and yet all these hacks come through the suppliers. So I think as we look to the future, these barriers, are going to, it's going to get muddy. And I will say on Procuretech 100, we debate this. I debate this with Lance, and we talk about this, and there's no easy answer. It's because
there's not.
Right. And the market's changing so fast that it's like, I think we're all playing catch up continually. And I can't imagine for my clients, we're just like getting bombarded with all this stuff to try and to decipher it. I think that's where good consultants can help, is to help decipher, but not to make decisions.
I would fully agree with you there. That it's really, really hard to be able to make that separation line. And I had the same problem as well, putting together procurement software outside. At what point do you say, this isn't Procuretech, it's not going in? There are some that are clearly that have something to do with procurement, but clearly isn't focusing on selling to procurement. And that's kind of where I drew my line. Would they typically sell that solution to a procurement professional rather than a finance or a legal professional? But yeah, if you're a manufacturing business, you're probably going to be more interested in logistics tech or ESG tech than you are in fintech, for example. It really depends on what type of organization you are and what you're looking to buy. I did like, and I'm just going to wheel back to one of the comments that you made around you like to leave it up to your clients to make the final decision around the tech. And that really spoke to me, because one of the things that I had in mind when I built my website, when I built my business, was really to say procurement leaders, for the most part, are smart enough to be able to do a detailed RFI, RFP process on a short list of solutions. it's just getting to that point that's their struggle, because A, they're busy, and B, because, as you alluded to, the market's so confusing and it's changing all the time. So giving them the tools to get to that point, in my opinion, is going to be their biggest pain point. And yes, some of them will hire a consultant to do the end-to-end process. Great, we all need to earn money from that somehow. But if they don't have, or if they do have limited means and limited budget, I don't know, my view, I'd love to hear what you think, but I think that's the real pain point. The real challenge is just there's a proliferation of tools out there in the market, and it's just knowing what's out there if you're not a practitioner that has deep knowledge of this space.
Yeah, I mean, I think, ultimately, there is some upskilling. Like, we have to lean into this. Historically, Procuretech has been the idea of digital procurement has been managed by half an FTE in these big or enterprise, half an FTE who manages the source to pay contract or the P2P contract, whatever the vendor. And
there's a special project, right? Development opportunity.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so that's not digital. That's just keeping the lights on and solving, a modicum of the issues that come up on a day-to-day basis. And so, and I'm not picking on procurement. I mean, procurement has a lot on their plate today, but over time, just like all of us use iPhones, but if you've ever watched a kid use an iPad or an iPhone, they do things, 100 times faster and better than we do as older folks. So I think naturally over time, this is going to change as we become much more adept at digital more broadly. And just like I was talking about the data and about the, understanding algorithms. And at the same time, we also have to understand that many of the consultants that walk in are biased. And I think we've had a lot of foxes guarding the hen house, to use that old cliche, because, and I'm very clear about biases and I stay independent because I think, and that's why I also don't want to do the final decision, because I don't want to sway a company based on my own sort of biases and influences. So, and I don't think we've been honest about that. Whereas your systems integrator is, tightly, enmeshed with the analyst, which is tightly enmeshed with the tech providers. You look at who's sponsoring these conferences, who's sponsoring these articles, who's sponsoring all this stuff. I don't think that's unique to procurement, but I also think it's problematic. And that's, and instead of taking them to task for doing that, I think that's natural in markets. But I also think if you have buyers that are more discerning and are willing to challenge that and make their own decisions and not outsource the decision making to third parties, then I think we start to get past that, and that market will react in the ways that become debiasing.
And with conferences, at least it's clear who's paid to be a sponsor, isn't it? They've got their names up in flashing lights, but in some of these reports that you read, it's not transparent if they're paid to play or not. At least with conferences, it's out there. You know who's paid to sponsor it. That you might get a glass of wine or a beer out of them if you go to the reception after it. But with a lot of these reports, it's not transparent at all.
No, exactly. And I have a real problem with that. And I think, I'm cranky because I'm getting old, but I have a problem with reports that say nothing, that are just saccharine and just sort of talk about, use a lot of buzzwords, but equally so that are just chock full of biases and sort of that there's a pay to play aspect of it. And I'm very anti pay to play. Even at conferences, although I take your point and agree that we know who's sponsoring it. First of all, I don't think that's a good money for the sponsors, but it just feels like, that it feels like everything has just become this gigantic circle exchange of money, of everybody scratching each other's backs. And I don't think that drives I don't think that drives the outcomes we want. And if you want evidence of that, look no further than the ERP market, because very little innovation, very little, and very poorly designed and sort of upkeep or upkept solutions that have not. I mean, part of our big supply chain problems today are a result of this very narrow, closed market that everybody's paying off one another in various degrees, not literally. Don't want to get in trouble, but I think that's I very much think that's I think that's part of our problem, is that if we're not really looking at where the money is flowing. And look, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, so I just think that's normal business, but I also think that's holding us back.
Yeah, and it's almost the old adage, the no one got fired for hiring IBM scenario. It's almost evolved into, in procurement tech, no one gets fired for sourcing supplier X.
Well, right. And I used that quote in my book. And I said nobody gets fired for choosing SAP, which I think is actually true. I mean, there's a certain logic to it, and I'm not criticizing SAP, not today. But I think that just because you don't get fired, and you could go back to the old days, just because you didn't get fired for choosing IBM doesn't mean succeeded. There's a difference. Not getting fired and succeeding are two totally different outcomes. And I would also say that succeeding, like, we are standing, this is a moment in time. If you go back 10 years, CIOs had a moment to make the pivot to become digital, to become chief digital officers. Some did, some didn't. I don't know what the differentiation are, but you can tell who made that pivot and who didn't. And I think procurement, we are standing at the precipice of this great opportunity. And so what are we going to do about it? And not going to buy old ways of working. Forget the technology. Just the entire old ways of working are not going to get you to the future and where we're going. And I think, and where we're going, I'm very excited about. And so I think there's a rocket ship engine for all of us to hop on to take that to the future.
That leads me really nicely on, actually, and I swear this is not scripted, to the last thing that I was going to ask you, which is, where is the future? What do you see? First of all, I wanted to ask, what do you see in terms of change when it comes to personnel structure within procurement teams? And I guess I mean by that sort of more diversification, more specialisms in roles. Is that something that you see? And if you do think that's the way it's going, what new sort of job titles or job roles do you think there will be?
Yeah, I think, certainly organizationally, I would argue that everybody in the organization the skills have to change. And because so much of the skills that we have been historically training on aren't going to, or they're getting digitized, whether it's automated or brought together through this intelligence. I think the category manager role declines, and in many cases, largely goes away. Now, not all my colleagues agree with that. Not everybody in the industry is ready to hear that. And I think there are certain categories and commodities that are very strategic you wouldn't necessarily whole scale get rid of. But on the other hand, I do think that there's going to be a skill change. And I would also argue that instead of hiring data scientists to come do procurement, I think procurement people have to develop more data science skills. And that doesn't mean programming algorithms. It just means, again, having a greater digital literacy around what we're trying to ask of technology or of digital. And so I think the skills change. I think the people change. And then, correspondingly, I think our org structures change. Unfortunately, I've been asked this question. I don't have a good new job titles, but I think we have to, We are going to have people with much broader business capabilities, because you also have now schools that are churning out students that are thing supply chain. So it's not just one thing. And they have stronger analytical capabilities because especially grads or MBA programs are spending a lot of time on advanced analytics. So the younger generation coming into the workforce, or at least the newer generation coming in, has a lot more skills that cross broader sets of business understanding and analytics. And even those that don't go to the MBA school, there's still, I think, a collective understanding in ways. If you just consume podcasts like this one or any of the, hundreds of others, can find podcasts and learnings on YouTube or even TikTok that bring greater level of competency that we've never seen before. We have access to information that has just never, that we've never had. So I think that changes. I think that fundamentally changes the organization and then the way we work. If it's going to be digital first, we are going to, work from a perspective of good user experience and automation. And I think the two really drive the future op model. I'll pause, but then I'll let you react to that. But I can also answer where I think we're going as a function.
Yeah, no, I completely sign up to that as well. I think personal accountability in terms of career development or skills, yeah, it's out there now, isn't it? 20 years ago, it wasn't possible unless you did a postgraduate study or unless you did some sort of extracurricular training. But now with YouTube and with online courses, things like Udemy and Skillshare and all of these platforms, I mean, yes, it won't get you to master's level, but it will at least give you a foundation that can help you upskill and survive the change that's coming in the workplace. Yeah, 100%.
There's also greater mentorship now. I think because of the, call it whatever, social connections, we're much more closely connected and mentoring one another or helping one another in ways that 20 years ago wasn't accessible, just didn't exist.
No, very true. Yeah. The final thing that I wanted to ask you, if we gaze into our crystal ball a little bit, is where do you think the biggest growth is going to be now in the sort of more holistic Procuretech market? And do you think it will go more downstream towards the mid-market and that will be the final frontier, or do you think there'll be a big mushrooming in the space of net zero, ESG, compliance, risk management in the enterprise space, or both?
So, well, I think it's both, and I think two things are going to happen. I think you're going to have mid-markets through what the big enterprise in the last 20 years. I think it'll be faster. It'll be a lot less painful for them, I hope, because I think, for better or worse, the enterprises just pioneered this and became the guinea pigs to drive through that. So the mid markets, I think, will get huge benefits as they adopt and mature this. So I think it's a really good time for them. On the enterprise agenda, it's very clear, at least I have a very clear argument. Whether people agree or whether it comes to pass is a different issue. But as a function, we've gone from cost, which was sort of 3 bids and a buy, to total cost, which factored in quality and delivery and rebates and all that. And I think, and that's sort of where we've come out of over the last 10, 15, 20 years. And now we're moving into total value. And total value to me is facilitating / driving innovation. It's ESG, all things ESG, which I think if we tease that apart is a whole mushroom cloud of its own. I think grouping it under ESG is almost a disservice. And then it's going to be risk and resiliency. And then it's going to be advanced cost, or I would say advanced value opportunities or partnership opportunities and or new business models is what I'm trying to get out. And I think all of those so risk, ESG, innovation, and new business models have nothing to do with cost savings. And now they're driven by that, they're enabled by that, and our jobs are de facto going to be cost savings. I don't think that changes. But if that's the only measurement, then I think that gets automated. I don't think that managing the elusive savings number each year, that's not, you can't hang your hat on that, and you certainly are not going to get or keep a seat at the big table, at the big leadership table. And so I think the question is in all of those new areas, they're all driven by third parties. Innovation is driven by third parties. Its risk comes through third parties. ESG, all through third parties, and they're all interconnected. And so I think it's incumbent. That's the opportunity. That's the short answer. That's the opportunity for us, because as we design next generation supply chains, as I alluded to earlier, they are going to be, they're going to consist increasingly of third parties. And we are now, the new way of working is all these multi-party businesses, whether they're partnerships or joint ventures or, all these different ways of operating as businesses. Like, that's really good. And who better to orchestrate all of that than procurement? That's our job, is to deal with third parties. Now, if you go back to, 3 bids and a buy, well, that's not really strategic. But if you think about how, is it Mercedes or BMW, one of them just did a partnership with NVIDIA, and where NVIDIA gets money from every car sold because they've embedded the NVIDIA processors and which NVIDIA is really, for those that don't know, really good at AI. They have AI chips. And so obviously the future of cars is more AI in itself. So just a partnership with NVIDIA is brilliant. Well, who better to facilitate that innovation than procurement? It's not that they have to do the R&D themselves. There's obviously going to be design and engineers, but figuring out how to negotiate that, because I'm sure you've been in a lot of negotiations that are all about getting to the lowest dollar amount, and was that they sharpen the pencil. Like, if you come in with that attitude, and that's not going to get you a car maker NVIDIA partnership. And I think that's where procurement's future is. And then conversely, procurement's job is to make sure that those chips or whatever those digital providers are not bringing risk into your enterprise.
It's a very, very valid point. And it's almost the whole, I've done a little bit of negotiation training in the past. And one of the first things I ask is, do you think Donald Trump is a good negotiator? Because it makes people think, right? Because if you want to buy a car and it's a one-time transaction, he's probably great. But if you've got to maintain a multi-year relationship with a supplier, then you probably wouldn't want him sat next to you at the table. And I do that just to get people thinking around the outcome. Is it a one-time transaction, or is it an ongoing relationship? But you're absolutely right. It's about procurement is so much more than cost savings. And I think one of the biggest challenges is getting CFOs to have the commercial literacy beyond just looking at purchase price variance, to be able to embed that in the way that we're measured. And yes, the worm is changing in some of these larger enterprises that see that, but I think there's a huge segment of the market that still doesn't get it.
Yeah, no, I think it's an evolution. But I think the innovators see that. And I think that's what's exciting about. That's why I love procurement. I get up every day excited about procurement, because I think we are at this transitory moment, and I think that's great. And I just you cannot drop a Donald Trump reference and not, I cannot let that go as an American that has suffered through the last 4 years. But I think you kind of alluded to this. And if you look at, it's the difference between a one-time transaction and developing relationships. And I think we saw 4 years, not to get political, but we saw 4 years of myopic one-time transaction. Give me the best price, and I'll whack you in the head on the way out the door too, just to boot. I don't think that's the way business operates in the 21st century. Certainly not in 2022 going forward, because we're just too interconnected. Today's cars are platforms, various platforms on wheels. I heard that yesterday. I think we are look at the Procuretech ecosystem. It's not suites versus best of breeds. It is this merging together of platforms. It's look at procurement and broader supply chains. It's not either or. We're coming together, and increasingly it's also my legal example from earlier, the commercial, the legal, and the procurement, like we're coming together. And so it's much, much more about collaboration and sharing and building ultimately relationships. And I think that's the piece that often gets missed in all of this, is that this is really tomorrow's business is about building and sustaining relationships.
And that is the perfect quote to end this session. Elouise, I'm extremely grateful of the time that you've spent with me today. We've almost clocked up an hour, and I know you've got a busy day ahead of yourself, so I'm going to let you go. But thank you so much for joining me. Last question, if anyone would like to connect with you or learn more about what you do, where's the best place that we can send them?
You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm sometimes slow, but you can absolutely reach me there. And also, you can also read my book on Amazon. And if you send me a note, I'm happy to send it to you as well. I don't make money off it, so I really want to just get it out there to everybody to read. So it has my direct tone in it. So.
That's it. Books and podcasts are not to make money. They're expensive business cards.
Exactly.
That philosophy too. Thank you so much. Have a great day. And keep in touch. It was a pleasure to have you on.
Indeed. Thank you. Bye.